We have a fairly powerful panel. Mr. Dharmakirti Joshi, he is the Chief Economist of CRISIL. We have Mr. Mukesh Bhutani, Non-Executive Chairman and Managing Partner, BMR Legal. Subhashri Gangopadhyay, Research Director of India Development Foundation. We have Mr. Bhupendra Yadav, Member of Parliament from Bharatiya Janata Party. Mr. D.K. Srivastav, Chief Policy Advisor at Ernst & Young. And Professor Abhijit Sen, former professor at JNU and former member of the Planning Commission. So thank you once again for joining the Business Today pre-budget panel discussion. We would like to focus, as I said, that we would like to break this discussion into four portions, segments. Essentially, first, if the panelists can tell us about what the numbers that have been presented so far by Mr. T.C. Anand, the chief statistician, show about the Indian economy pre-demonetization, because these numbers all relate to the September I think they end at the September quarter, right? None of them.
October.
Yeah, October quarter. So then we have, what do they think will be the effect of demonetization in the next 2 quarters? Then finally, what should be the priorities of Mr. Jaitley when he presents this budget, which is unusual in many ways, because first it merges the railway budget with itself. Then it is almost a month before the conventional schedule, which also means that he is only taking into account the numbers which have been presented till October, essentially for all his calculations, and not numbers post-October. I think the bulk of the calculations will be largely the October numbers, will be based on the October numbers. Then, of course, there will be the fact that this is the first time that plan and non-plan will not happen separately, so it will be a different presentation. Then finally, the most interesting segment is that what do you realistically expect him to present? Not the previous segment, which is what his priorities are and what he should be focusing on, but what do you expect given the political pressures and the political economy and everything, all the other pressures, what do you expect the budget to be focused on? Should we start with Mr. Joshi?
Sure. So you want me to answer
so we will start the first, that where did you see that, that what were both the good news and the bad news about the economy till October from the numbers that have been presented?
Well, I think the numbers that have come out, they don't capture the post-demonetization impact clearly. And I think the general expectation was that since this is a year of good monsoon, since we have a mild push to demand that will come from the increase in salaries of government employees and the veterans, and also monetary policy has a lagged impact on growth. So some of it might start filtering in. So that was expected to lift the growth in the second half. Now, the demonetization has clearly offset that, more than offset. So clearly growth is going to slow down in the second half of this fiscal year and not increase as was expected earlier. So I think clearly what we should expect is a downward revision of these numbers once you go to revised estimates. So this seems to be an overestimate at this juncture, because
yeah, I just wanted to also clarify a point that where the numbers which came in the second quarter of this year, were they better than the numbers at the beginning of the year? I mean, did they show the same trend, or were they not showing? Were they showing a deterioration of expectations, or?
Well, broadly on the similar lines. I mean, there was no major disruption in the first and second quarters, of this year. And I think so. It was obviously slightly weaker because I think you had the impact of 2 bad monsoons and filtering into the economy, and there's been no kick to the economy from either fiscal or monetary. So the economy was slowly coming down and was expected to lift in the second half.
Okay.
Well, you need to be much beyond a trained economist, which I am not, to be able to predict what the numbers would be like. It could be anybody's guess. We were looking, the first segment was actually looking at what were the numbers already presented, what was the picture they were showing. Yeah, so to some extent I agree with Mr. Joshi that many of the numbers really did not factor in the impact of demonetization, and I'm not sure that even if today you want to sit and assess the impact, you can do it with some reasonable degree of accuracy or deploy some scientific tools to be able to do that. I would imagine that in order for people to even assess the impact, we will have to see this fiscal year pass through. And hence it becomes a challenge of sorts for Mr. Jaitley as to what kind of budget he's going to present, which would be a mix of fiscal measures, possibly more announcement on the monetary front, easing of restrictions on cash withdrawal, so on and so forth. I can talk a little bit about what he should actually do. And again, there are too many balls in the air for him. For example, if he's going to sit down and assess the impact of tax revenues for next year, a fairly large variable sitting over there is whether GST will come or not. Because if GST comes, his calculations and projections for tax would look very different than it would look otherwise. So that's a very important variable. I think the second is that we've been talking about tax reforms more at the administrative level, and I can think of at least a couple of reports which have caught his attention, whether it's the Tax Administrative Reforms Commission detailed reports of Dr. Shom, or whether it's Justice Ishwar Committee's report, and we would see the second report also coming out, where he's trying to address the ease of doing business. How does India reduce litigation to avoid more investment? How do we really take away the pressure of the taxman from an administration viewpoint? So I think he'll have to pick and choose a lot. But I think that there is very limited fiscal room that he has to kind of play around with giveaways. So we should anticipate that the common man will get a relief, partly to elevate the difficulty that the common man has been through as a result of demonetization. But the larger reforms, for example, roadmap for reduction of corporate tax rates to 25%, I doubt if that would come, and I hope I'm wrong. Because industry is very keenly awaiting for that. And you have all sorts of other challenges that he has. So I think it's not going to be an easy exercise for the government to, measure what would be the impact of this on the revenues of the government. And hence there would be a close eye that the government will have on the fiscal deficit. Because if the fiscal deficit goes out of control, it will have a different kind of impact on the investor sentiment. So I think it's a challenge of sorts.
Subhashish, what do you think? Were the numbers showing before pre-demonetization, was it a gloomy picture or was it an okay picture?
Yeah, I'll stick to your first theme, right, which is on what the numbers pre-demonetization show. I'm not surprised by this slowing down, right, because I think much of what the economy or the country now needs is state-level activity, and the central government can do very little to, it can create an ethos, but the actual things on the ground have to be done by the state governments. So, and there I'm afraid that some states are doing very well, of course, but there are many states which are still caught up in the pre-90s mindset. So I'm not surprised by these figures. If you observe that investment has really not done what it should have done, so it's not surprising that our growth rates are slowing down. Plus, there was some discussion of the GST, and I think Indian businesses are not very good at risk-taking. I'm sure everybody is waiting and watching to figure out how this GST system pans out before they take long-term decisions. So I think this year was not a surprise for me. The fact that the GST has been pushed back, or seems to have been pushed back, creates uncertainties for next year too. But I was looking at this year as just a readjustment year.
Pre-demonetization.
This is pre-demonetization, yes.
Mr. Bhupendra Yadav.
I think first when we talk about the demonetization.
No, let's look at the pre-demonetization.
Yes, even the demonetization. Sometimes we discuss the demonetization as a single act. It's not a single act. It's a sequel of is an event which shows the commitment of the government. What this government did for last 2 years. Government did a work for a social inclusion, then the economic growth of this country by to providing a facility to the small sector like Mudra Yojana and other Yojana. Then government did so many legislative change, executive orders, some commitment, and some programs like Pragati. The long waiting project is pending because of our federalism for last 20 years, 30 years. That's cleared by the government in the Pragati program only for the purpose of growth. So the social security, economic inclusion, then transparent administration. then tax simplification, that is the main object of the government. So even the last year, the bill passed by the government, either it was GST, or it was bankruptcy insolvency law, or it was an amendment in SARFAESI Act, or it was a Benami Act, or it was an amendment in DRT Act, or it was an amendment in Prevention of Corruption Act, or recently the ordinance issued in the Payment of Wages Act. That will change the complete system of the governance. There is a synchronization of the rail budget and the general budget also shows the commitment of the government that we will not go on the populistic measure. We want a stable development of this country, the stable development of the infrastructure of this country. As per the agriculture sector discussed by earlier also, if you show the data of the agriculture sector, there will be an increase of 6% in this buoy of the agriculture for the last 2 and 3 years. So there will be, I think even after demonetization, if you see the data, there will be a good crop in the agriculture, especially in the Rabi season, because our country mainly depend on this Rabi season. So I think demonetization is a point which will create a road ahead. The last commitment of the government or the working of the government, it will give a push in future.
Well, I see the macro fiscal news pre-demonetization as spelling out a major policy challenge to the government. If we look at the output side, except for agriculture and public administration, all sectors show a lowering of growth. If we look at the demand side, then you would notice that the rate of gross fixed capital formation has been falling successively for 3 quarters. And the fall has been increasing in terms of the magnitude of the fall. And therefore, there is a major investment contraction that has already set in even before demonetization comes up on the scene. And demonetization, for all its pluses and minuses, will actually, nobody denies that it implies a kind of consumption contraction. So you have a macro situation where investment contraction is being followed by consumption contraction, and therefore if this is the major policy challenge, then there has to be a clear route for the government to let the economy emerge out of this kind of macro fiscal challenge. So I would say that we are now positioned, and in fact it is in some ways bad news, because all the time we were thinking that pre-demonetization at least we would have the old budget estimates of 7.6% for GDP and 7.4 at least for GVA. But now pre-demonetization it has come to 7.1 and 7. And therefore whatever is to be added is a further bad news on this. And therefore the policy challenge is really how aggressive can the government be in order to stimulate the economy, and what should be the sequence of that. That is whether fiscal or monetary. Now added to this is the challenge that is coming out from the way the world economy is shaping up. Now you know that Mr. Trump has promised that he will reduce the corporate income tax rates all the way from something like 34, 35 to 15%. And the interest rate in the US is is slated to go up, and therefore a lot of FDI and FII will all, not only from this but all general emerging economies, would start flowing out. So you would need to stimulate the economy precisely at the time when a good amount of potentially investable resources would be difficult to attract. And therefore it's a major policy challenge at which we are sitting. And I am talking about the macro fiscal picture only.
I basically agree with what Dr. Srivastava said. Let me put it this way. I had expected a much better first half for this year than what we got. The reason I had expected a better first half was that the world economy was looking up rather than down as now. The first half also happens to be when everybody thought that Clinton was going to win rather than Trump was going to win. And the world economy was supposed to be going on a certain trajectory. Domestically, the two big news about this particular fiscal was A, that we are going to have normal monsoon after 2 very bad ones, I personally expected agriculture to grow at around 8% this year, and you had bounce back not only because of that, but also because of the pay commission in consumption spending. Added to that is what Mr. Yadav said, the government actually managed to clear two very important acts, the GST one and the bankruptcy one, which I had hoped would actually give investors reason to actually become optimistic. None of them happened. Essentially what has happened is investment has gone on its way downwards, and that's the main reason for the lack of demand that you see. I don't think we are seeing in the first half any real supply side contraction. It's mainly a demand side contraction. And the question really is that were we wrong on consumption side as well? On the final consumption, where could we have gone wrong? Is it that the agricultural, even before demonetization, the incomes weren't growing as far as, or is it that the data will be revised later or something?
So see
But I think the story is, I had really expected 7.7, 7.8 sort of a thing. We've got 7.1 is what really it's the first half figure. First half continuing into 4 quarters. So I think really it's disappointing to start with, and mainly disappointing on the investment side. Now that could be public investment, but it's mainly still private investment.
If I may just, if I may just add two other things to the pre-demonetization story. I think one, demand was still a challenge because the utilization of capacity was very, very low, and I think it was below the trigger thresholds for private investment to take place. And second was the financial sector was constrained to support growth because of the non-performing assets in the banking sector. So that was also a constraint to the economy that was still even before demonetization.
If I'm not wrong, T.C. Anand's figures at that point of time, when he released the second quarter figures, he showed that there was an uptick in consumption in the last month or something like that. That the consumption had just started beginning to pick up, I think, in the second half of the year. But that we do not know that what will happen after demonetization. So we will start from you this time. That okay, what do you expect the demonetization effect to be? The total.
See, I think it's such an unknown.
Yeah.
With very different types of data pouring in. We've got relatively optimistic projections by the finance minister, for example, on the basis of the tax data. And we've got a whole slew of very pessimistic projections from a lot of people on the ground. My own assessment are the following. The one thing demonetization has almost certainly done is it would have contracted demand, consumption demand certainly. So given that we already had a demand side problem, that would have got multiplied. There is nothing to suggest that that's going to be made up, the consumption shortage will be made up on the capital goods side. Because we are seeing the only figures that we have is that credit growth has turned negative as well. So if the news was bad on the demand side, pre-demonetization, it's going to be even worse in the next 6 months. As far as the supply side constraints are concerned, I think this is new and this is big, because there is clearly, as a result of demonetization, a major obstacle to working capital, especially in the unregistered sector, to actually work. The way the working capital has worked so far has hit a huge roadblock, and it will take time not just for working capital to revive, even when the currency comes back, but for new arrangements to be found, new definitions of trust to be formed for that sector to rebound back. So this time it's not just demand, it's also on the supply side, and this is mainly to do with liquidity constraints which will affect the working capital arrangements, particularly for the non-registered sector. Taken together, and this of course is sticking my head out, I would be very surprised if we touch 5% in the next 2 quarters. I mean,
5%
taken
for
together.
the two quarters. So that will give for the whole year, that will be what?
Well, for the whole year, it's an average of 5 and 7, so it's a year about 6.
Well, we have no...
And that's optimistic.
There is no controversy that there is a contraction around the economy, and it is consumption-led. The effect of demonetization is to add a consumption-led contraction on a pre-existing investment-led contraction. There are two clues. So the question is only about the magnitude and extent of this contraction. And it is, of course, very difficult to surmise as to what this would eventually turn out to be in the final analysis. But I think there are 2 or 3 clues that we can talk about. One is, what is the effective currency availability relative to GDP in the demonetization period? And whereas there is a lot of data around, we notice that the effective currency to GDP ratio, which in India pre-demonetization or at the point of demonetization was about 12.5 or so, has been halved effectively for these last 2 months, even as the remonetization process made progress, and that's a massive contraction of available currency in the system, and therefore it is going to have a sharp effect. The second clue is the sectoral clues as to what were the sectors that were relatively more cash intensive, and for example, agriculture, construction, we talk about some retail trade, and some of the services that are cash intensive. So obviously those sectors will have a heavy load to bear as a result of contraction. Now some of these service sectors actually do have a high, relatively large weight in the GDP. So if one were to hazard a guess, one would say that remonetization actually has been far slower than one would have expected had this been policy that was really predetermined to a large extent. And as a result of that, we have suffered a heavy shortage of effective availability of currency. Some of these things could have been avoided. But I would say that because of this, the fall in the GDP ratio, the GDP growth would be in the range of 1 percentage point at least.
There is just one supplementary question, for all panelists, in fact, is that, see, some clarity is coming out on the remonetization effort. What do you expect that by, we have what now, I think, what about 50% of the currency back in circulation? Roughly 50%?
Lakh crore is 8.5 lakh crore.
So we are talking, yeah. So I think, in fact, the SBI chief said that, that it is very likely that by February end, at least the bulk of the cash which is required will be back.
Well,
will that lead to a bounce back?
We know in a monetary policy context, we have entered into what sometimes policymakers call a dark corner.
Okay.
And that is because of the fact that the inclination of people to hold on to currency has gone up to a very large extent. It's almost infinity. That is to say, when people get hold of currency, they just hold on to it. The normal process used to be that you get currency, you use it in exchange, it goes back into the banking system and is then circulated. But now almost 2 months now, and people are not putting their currency back into the system, and therefore every time when you go to withdraw, it's a new currency note that you are getting hold of. And therefore, this is a very unpredictable area in which we have entered. So, although remonetization may exceed, let us say, about 70% or so by the end of, by mid-March, the habit of the people that has changed, it will take time for them to normalize. And therefore, we have to allow for this also.
Mr. Yadav?
Yes. You see, when you talk about the impact of demonetization, first thing must be clear in economy also, whether there will be a more and more good economic advice. But if you don't have a transparent system, if you don't have a commitment, if you don't have a economic inclusion of poor people, then you will not achieve your target, whatever may be the good advice or whatever may be anything. I thanks to Mr. Abhijit Sen that he appreciated that government did 2 good work. One, the GST, and second, about the bankruptcy and insolvency law. But it yet to be completed. But Yeah, we must know the things, how things work in our country. This insolvency report by the Law Commission given in 1960, old insolvency law of 1907. We brought our constitution in 1947. We made a clause in our constitution that an insolvent person cannot become a member of parliament and a member of any legislative assembly. But we don't have a law. So the things which pending for 70 years, we did in two years. Now the administrative part is also beyond. There the vacancy is published and everything is published. So system was failed for last 70 years. Then the second thing is GST. It was a historic move. It's not by a single party. It's a political will of every political party. It's a will of government. But in last 3 months, government did so many things regarding the tax rate, slab, compensation to the state, functioning of GST council. Only the last part is a tax administration, and that will be resolved. So we hope that what the government take steps as a consultation and all the aspect and the functioning of GST council. If you read in the newspaper, it's a efficiency of the government that they take a consensus in all the subject, and I think the bill was passed as a consensus by the parliament. It will be soon come in the picture also. But now the thing is, what will be the impact of after the demonetization? Definitely a tax base in our country will be increased. Second, in future we will get a fair GDP. Third, the major threatening to our economy is a parallel economy, parallel cash transaction economy, and that is the reason last UPA government brought the CTT, then they withdrew it. The parallel economy and the parallel cash economy is also a challenge. So many questions raised in the economics by the economist person and the other persons about that it is a threat to the village or agriculture. If it is this, then why there is an increase in the sowing of the Rabi crop? Even I visited personally to Bihar after demonetization. I visited to Jharkhand. The large part of country want a economic inclusion, a fair system. You know, a person who is pulling a rickshaw, who is tempo, he don't have a fair income. How he will show to the bank that this is my income? If we will go by the digital way, we are able to include more and more person in a economic system. You know, only the slogan of Garibi Hatao is not important. If we want a improvement of a life of a person, we want to economically include them, our financial institution for them. So bank transaction is not only for the purpose of some big person, it will for the poor person. The third thing, the government social benefit scheme must be reached to the poor person. That is the reason we brought the Aadhaar bill. We bring a bill because why? We want to give a fair wages and all things to the poor people.
But Mr. Yadav, what we were planning, I mean, my question was limited to essentially not that whether it is good or it is bad, but what is the short term, the very short term, and which is the next 2 quarters effect, and which will essentially, you know, because this is a pre-budget discussion, that what will it help
in absence of any certain data. We ourselves say that certain data is available only to October 15.
Yeah.
So if the certain data is not available, then how can you predict any other thing? Let we hope that decision is taken by a firm view will give a good impact.
Subhashish, there are a few things that I wanted to, I mean, staying on the same topic, but especially this side, I would like to, the next 3 panelists, I would like to address the question about that. One is that we are seeing a certain amount of tax data also being presented by the FM about increased taxation and all that. We have simultaneously seen a credit shortage, a credit drop, the credit demand drop. Post demonetization, how do you see things play out, and especially since that there are, do you also see certain sectors gaining and certain sectors other, will there be major losers and gainers? I mean, one of the people who say that a lot of gains have been made on the fintech and banking sector, but the banking sector, yeah, but the only thing is that the banking sector is that 2 views are coming out that that did banking sector gain because a lot of money got deposited, or did they actually lose because RBI put in all sorts of conditions, including that, that you have to hold it without any this thing, and they have actually done some amount of cost calculations that how much the banking sector has undergone in terms of suffering. So if you could start with that.
Yeah,
So.
well, let me start by saying that I'm in a peculiar dilemma when it comes to demonetization.
Yeah.
Because about 4 years ago, from our institution, we had done a big report on how the economy can go cashless.
Yeah.
And there we had talked about the MIN approach, right? M for mandatory, so some rules need to be changed. I for incentivization of why people should be going to digitized money. And the last one was network, which was the Aadhaar platform. So the fact that demonetization is moving us towards that, gets me very excited. But of course, the impact of the demonetization, immediate impact, is what we are discussing here. So let me first mention about or respond to your last point. Regardless of whether money is coming into the bank or not, I don't think there was ever a discussion with investment going down, right? There was ever a discussion about people not being able to get hold of funds because banks were unwilling to lend. So the fact that the banks have no money has not changed that, right? So I don't think it will have any impact unless there is real reason for investment to pick up. The fact that banks have money is not going to help, because just because they have money, they are not going to make loans to projects that they would not have otherwise funded. I don't think the rate of interest is the issue here. The rate of interest for long-term investment, if you, especially when we are talking of major changes in the economy, we are going through a transformation. The interest rate this way or that, even though we talk about it ad nauseum, if not ad infinitum, I don't think that affects the investment that much, right? Especially in a changing economy like ours, it's investor confidence that is more important. That has not happened as yet, in the short term. But I think to be able to understand the impact of demonetization, yes, it will have a negative impact. There's no denying that, right? How much, I don't know, because I'm not going to be a good economist and start predicting. I'm not going to do that. But I think one thing we have to understand that, and this we have to acknowledge, that the informal sector, which is a large part of our economy as opposed to the parallel economy, the informal sector is a large absorber of this so-called black money. And hence, we see what we are observing, what we observe. So when, for whatever reason, that was squeezed, right? The black economy was squeezed. Whether people got out of it by, their own resourcefulness or not is something that we will know later. But it was squeezed. And the moment it was squeezed, the informal sector was squeezed. And hence we hear about people losing jobs. Much of those jobs were actually funded with resources from this parallel economy. And hence, I wouldn't call it parallel, because it was not very parallel. It was quite integrated to the actual economy in this way, right, to the informal sector. So for us, right, the important thing is how quickly can we make the informal sector into a formal sector. All the good things about demonetization that we are talking about will have an impact if we can reduce the informal sector and increase the...
In fact, I think in your last, in another panel discussion for this same place, you had taken the example of the labor contractor with black
Never
money.
hold me responsible for what I had said before. But yes, I do believe that all these thresholds should go. Obhijit mentioned unregistered sector. I don't see why we should have unregistered sector. We must be able to figure out why it is that in spite of all these incentives that registration gives you in terms of access to various schemes of the government, both at the local as well as the central level, yet firms or enterprises don't get registered. We have to understand this. I think there is too much talk about demonetization, black economy, without us really figuring out why is it that people want to stay below the radar, right? And I think the demonetization exercise, badly managed and implemented though it is, right, gives us huge opportunities to restructure our economy. And that's the reason why I don't think that something phenomenal will happen very soon unless we have sort of fitted all these pieces in place. But we now have an opportunity to do that. I'm not going to talk anything about the lack of tax data and all of that, because I'll soon be followed by a tax expert, right? So I'm not going to take away his time.
Before I get to the tax, want to make a few observations. I think nobody will deny today that demonetization is going to have its impact. I think the two areas that people are speculating and guessing, is that impact short term or is it medium term? I'd like to believe it is short term. Second, that what is it that the government should be doing on an immediate basis to be able to reduce the impact of that? I'd just like to pick up the clue from what Subhashish mentioned, this parallel economy which is interwoven with the formal part of the economy. Some economists believe that because the informal part of the economy is getting impacted as a result of demonetization, even otherwise it was not being reckoned for the purpose of measuring the GDP, so it is not going to have any impact. Because of this interwoven principle, Subhashi, that you talked about, it is getting impacted. So let's assume that someone is running a formal business, he has a PAN number, TAN number, he's got VAT registrations, he pays excise duty, but there is this intermediary transaction in his formal part of the business which is all in cash. How is that getting impacted through demonetization? One, layoffs. Two, possibly less production. And I also feel that this segment of the economy will get into the parallel economy sooner than later. That is where the point that Mr. Yadav made, that you are likely to see more taxpayers coming into the tax space. But there are two aspects, sir, that are very importantly contingent upon that happening. Number one is the quality of data mining that the government does. As of today, the government is sitting on a whole lot of data to be able to track which are these informal parts of the economy that needs to get into the tax net. Merely sending out notices is not intelligent data mining in my view, and I have practiced this for all these years. The second point is what I made earlier, deep tax administrative reforms. Today, let's look at the challenge that small, micro, medium enterprises are facing. They either cannot afford the services of professionals, or they feel the risk of getting harassed. There is a fundamental problem that we deal with in India when it comes to administering our taxes. We have considered tax evasion straight as an economic/criminal offense. In the western part of the world, including in major parts of the world, tax evasion is a civil offense. That doesn't mean I'm trying to trivialize the debate on tax evasion or I'm trying to propagate the tax evasion. So I think government needs to be very clear that when it calibrates tax administrative reforms for tax evaders, that it has an approach where it collects its fair share of taxes, but also doesn't follow a name and shame philosophy. I can tell you, not just small, medium and micro enterprises, even large enterprises fear today, will the government name and shame? Because that's what they are very worried about. This name and shame philosophy puts a kind of fear and paranoia in the minds of businesses, and hence the debate for deeper tax administrative reforms assumes significance in the new paradigm. The last is more an economic issue, and I will leave it to the judgment because there are too many economists today. I was reading the piece by Dr. Ajay Shah in the morning, making out a compelling case for significant reduction in the interest rates. He's not talking about a percentage point, he's talking about a significant reduction. To some extent, it's a gamble, but I think in the current environment, the government will have to experiment with 2-3 out-of-box ideas to be able to set the impact of demonetization from what most people view it as medium term into short term. But I think it's a given that the impact is going to be there in the short term. So I would say, to summarize, be bold on interest rates, be bold on tax administrative reforms, and make sure that, and I think the Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog has already made a statement that he fears himself that the tax officials should not go completely unchecked and clear a fear psychosis in the minds of taxpayers, because some of these taxpayers may be underreporting, may not be reporting, but they are certainly your taxpayer base for the future of this country.
Just before you stop, one quick question, and then we will come to Mr. Joshi also. And I'm going purely by newspaper reports. The additional numbers of taxpayers, potential taxpayers that the government is looking at. He said something about some 6 crores more, or what did you say? So
see, you're going to get additional taxpayers, Prosenjit, in 3 ways.
Yeah.
One is this immediate impact of IDS scheme. You have IDS 1, and in a way I consider the Pradhan Mantri Yojana also as the IDS 2. So you're going to add this taxpayer base. The second taxpayer base...
But no, just one moment.
Yeah.
Is that additional to a taxpayer base, or is it saying that somebody who was pretending to be in 10% now getting into 30%?
Not necessarily. So you have quite a few people in the IDS who were never paying taxes.
Okay.
They're coming into your tax net.
Okay. So
The second set of taxpayers are going to come as a result of a change in ecosystem where the economy is moving into digital.
Yeah.
Because the quality of data mining that the government will do will force these taxpayers. Let me put it this way. There's a whole lot of disincentive for people to cheat the government. And the third is the government can do it proactively by way of progressive tax policies. So for example, it is speculated widely that the tax rate slabs may change and income below 50 lakhs will still not get to a maximum marginal tax rate. Actually, I have been advocating personally, start with a normal tax rate of 5%. Get people into this habit of paying taxes, which they are not in a habit of paying taxes in our country. The moment you do that, you'll automatically see your taxpayer base growing over a period of time. So I think it's partly the government's actions, and it's partly a change in the ecosystem, and it's partly by way of tax reforms. Because I don't see how the government, the only way for the government to reduce the impact of demonetization on the common man is to give them a tax relief. Now, whether that comes by way of a higher standard deduction, which government is speculating, more deduction for housing loans, more deduction for medical bills, or a change in slab rates, or a combination of all that, it is going to come in. I mean, look at it this way. If the average working age of a citizen is 35, you're going to add more and more younger people into the taxpayer base in the country. Majority of them are going to be salaried payers. Entrepreneur organizations will also start paying taxes in the future. So you're really... Clearly, demonetization and the digital agenda of the government has put in motion a path for a sustained increase in taxpayer base in the country.
Well, as far as the growth is concerned, we as of now expect about 100 basis point lower growth in 2016-17 as a result of demonetization. Now, let me also come to another unintended consequence, which is if your growth goes down, the inflation also goes down. And I think we've already seen that the inflation has come much below. This is not a great way of bringing inflation down, but inflation has come below the central bank's expectation, but not enough to propel them to cut rates further. And the reason is inflation, I mean, the war is still on inflation because the central bank has a target of 4% over the medium run. And if they want to lower inflation to that, then the monetary policy will always have a disinflationary bias. I mean, so you can't have very aggressive rate cuts. So that's, what I want to say is that the impact on growth is transitory. So is it the impact on inflation as well. So it's not going to last. I think the other thing that it has done is some of the sectors that were cash dependent obviously have got hit more, but the interlinked sectors have also get hit. I mean, I'll give you an example. Real estate is a sector which has a lot of cash component, but cement is a sector which doesn't have so much cash component but is very closely linked to real estate. So I think as a knock-on effect to real estate, cement sector is also going to go down. So that's one example of how the pain is going to transmit to the other sectors. The sectors which will see the pain for a little longer period are sectors like real estate, gems and jewelry, and cement, and maybe luxury goods as well, because I think a lot of luxury good purchases used to happen in cash. Other sectors will rebound fairly quickly. And as far as the tax information is concerned, I think we are getting a lot of noise right now because I think this is a disruption. So you're seeing some tax collections go up, some go down, but overall looks like, I mean, that the direct tax collections will see if you take a second half of this year, will be more than what was anticipated earlier, and indirect tax collection should go down because the growth itself is going down, production itself is going down, and the net tax collections, which is an open question right now, I think will be an interaction of both of these. I mean, whether the direct tax collections offset the fall in indirect tax collections. Our assessment is that you'll be a net gainer this year as far as taxes are concerned.
Two quick questions. One is that if we can stay in the topic of inflation itself.
Yeah.
We are seeing consumer price inflation coming down. But I think that with global commodity prices going up slightly, I think WPI had started going up, hardening for the 6 months. Do people expect the global price commodities to continue on an upward trend, or will it be largely is this like oil price, one keeps reading that that it will go up, or it'll more supplies will come in and stuff like that. So will that have any effect on the WPI, or will it not?
Well, I think there are four
factors. What are the expectations? Yeah. So.
Four factors that will influence inflation. One is clearly not only oil but the other commodity prices also. Yeah. Not much uptick can be expected. There is some firming up, but I think we don't see it to go beyond the current levels. The second is exchange rate. It's depreciated a bit. If exchange rate and commodity price increase, both can create some pressure on inflation, and that's the reason why central bank held its horses in the month of December. Third factor is going to be monsoons again. Next year is again we don't know how they're going to play out, and food prices depend on to some extent on them. And then the fourth factor is going to be the speed of recovery itself. If you recover quickly, then I think inflationary whatever pressure might come back again. So I think all these four factors will need to be watched going ahead, and the biggest external risk is the oil prices and also the other commodity prices.
See, I think I'll take on something slightly different, which is related to inflation. Is usually the other thing, which is interest rates. Yeah. And Bhatani just said, he expects, he thinks that a large interest rate cut might be a good thing. Now that made me think that really one of the sectors which we think might be doing very well might actually be doing rather badly in the medium term. It's not the short term even, it's next 2-3 years. The entire banking sector is not only under massive stress with NPAs. What the current episode has done to the banking sector is to massively increase its liabilities. After all, deposits in banks are not assets of banks, they are liabilities of banks. In a situation where the demand for credit does not seem to be going up. On top of that, banks are being told, and this, for example, this whole petrol thing which happened last night, they are being told that keep your charges down. The entire sector is being told keep your charges down. So you are actually thinking that here's this sector which will deliver costlessly. Things which do actually cost money. And given that, I think the banking sector is being put into a sort of stress which it has not known for a very, very long time. Up to now it has been the guy behind the counter who's got a huge queue out there. Now it is actually the treasury people in the banks who will be under stress because the balance sheets, if anything, look much worse than they used to. Now, when that happens, then this is not just a sectoral problem. It has much stronger, and some of these effects are hysteresis. And I think, therefore, I would actually say, I just took off from inflation into interest rates, but I think that's important. And under those circumstances, inflation might not be such a bad thing. I think because that would be one of those things which actually reduces people's, except me, retired people always lose with inflation, but anyone who's got loans have to actually.
As per the real estate is concerned, in our thinking process, we are so many times argumentative rather than decisive. Why? There is an unreasonableness in real sector, or it will not affect to the housing sector. In the ease of doing business, if the real estate price is unreasonable, it is not good for the purpose of the manufacturing and other purpose also. Even if some persons or some boy want to take a shop in a small market, he will give a pagdi, a large money, which is not useful or which will not be productive or anything. So we want to regularize all these things. We see that in future, if this will come in a down way, so it will be helpful to that purpose also. The same time also when we say that there is the NPAs in bank, so we say no, banks are in difficulty. Now we are saying that there is a money in the bank, so we are in difficulty. So what government did? Take a decision, commitment and transparency. I think these three things will give a future road.
May I just say something?
Yeah.
I think what Abhijit said is very, very important. Our banking sector, our financial sector as a whole, in many ways we have become very modern in terms of accounting norms, having all these various committees within corporate governance and all of that. But the actual functioning, especially of banking, because we are a bank-based, investment-driven system, is still, very, very backdated. The bankers and the investors or companies don't deal with each other in the way that a modern economy should. So I think whatever he was saying is absolutely valid. Unless that happens, I don't think we'll be able to take advantage of that. And in that context, since you said real estate, I think indeed one of the big things we need to do, and again, the fact that the real estate market is being reorganized because of demonetization gives us an opportunity to take a very hard look at how our land market operates, or does not operate at all, in fact.
Well, let me take up this point about whether there is a very strong case for a very large rate reduction, policy rate reduction. The issue is about whether monetary stimulus should play the leading role or whether the fiscal stimulus should play a leading role. And in fact, I take the viewpoint that actually when you have a sequence in which investment contraction has preceded consumption contraction, then you have to first come out of the consumption contraction, get rid of the inventories that have piled up before investment will pick up. And therefore, today if we were to reduce interest rates, it will not really induce the economy to take off because there is such a lack of demand. And therefore, it's an issue of sequencing. And the sequencing has got to be a budget initiative. And the budget initiative must be a very aggressive fiscal stimulus. And therefore, one has to really talk about what are the avenues from which such fiscal stimulus can come out. What is the scope? How much can the central government do? Now, it's already committed as far as the present FRBM is concerned to achieving a 3% fiscal deficit target next year. And that really does not give government much scope for additional borrowing, because linking it slightly to the inflation issue, in these numbers that the CSO brought out yesterday, you would notice that the inflation rate based on implicit price deflator is about 4.5%. Now, if you look at what is a good predictor of the inflation rate based on implicit price deflator, we find that this is CPI non-fuel, which has been very stable at about 3%. And in fact, therefore, the 4.5% may be a very temporary figure, and for the year as a whole, it may turn out to be close to 3% inflation. That should be related to implicit price deflator, which means that the nominal GDP would not be 12%, close to 12%, which is what is coming out of these figures, but it would be closer to 10%, which means that the denominator of the fiscal deficit would go down. In absolute terms, available fiscal deficit that can be availed of in this year and next year would be a little less than what has been predicted. And therefore, the room for fiscal stimulus has got to be found, because nothing else will work. And therefore, I would suggest that there are 3 or 4 routes still available. One is that we already have a committee deliberating on whether we should have a modification of the FRBM Act for the central government, and state governments have themselves come up and said that kindly allow us to borrow more, at least by 0.5 percentage point. And if we have a central government modification of the FRBM, which is a cyclically adjusted norm of fiscal deficit, rather than this very static norm, and all the world over, that is the way that fiscal discipline is being adhered to, then we can have a room for at least 0.5 percentage point of relaxation of fiscal deficit next year. Half should be allowed to the state governments, and then bring on the state governments on board for this stimulus programs because central government alone cannot do it. And then you have the public sector enterprises, and there you have a little degree of control, and their borrowing is outside your system, and therefore you can allow them to borrow. And then there may be some off budget borrowing, because last year also in the railways most of the expansion program was based on off budget borrowing. And this year also, even though the budget may get integrated, I expect that there is no other way in which to finance the ambitious expansion plans of the railways. So departmental enterprises, public enterprises, central government and state governments all taken together can at least give us a fiscal stimulus of 2 to 2.5% of GDP. And unless we do that, it is very difficult to come out of this consumption contraction. And the quicker we do it, the quicker it would be possible for the monetary policy and interest rate reduction to play an effective role. So if we can sequence it, if we can put the extent right, the economy can still come out of these doldrums. And if we wait for an excessive time, we would be playing into the global forces, because the global forces actually are now all inward looking. Most of the US economy policies, the European policies, almost all of them are now looking at very heavy debt to GDP ratios and close to negative interest rates. In other words, when we came out of the 2008 crisis, for the world as a whole, fiscal policy has got exhausted, heavy debt, and monetary policy has got exhausted. We are close to very low interest rates. People are talking about negative interest rates, and therefore India has to stand on its own, on its domestic stimulus, and this is the way it should be done.
Fully agree.
Yeah, no, all I was saying is, I think if you look at, we have been following a conservative fiscal policy, we can say in the last, so government has been very, very prudent as far as the public finances are concerned. We brought the fiscal deficit down, but if you look at the debt levels of center or center plus states,
it's coming down.
No, so it's rising. Center plus states.
Only the last 1 year.
Yeah, last 1 year. Yeah. So there is.
But till then it was falling. It's only the last 1 year.
Long-term trend is a very significant fall. We are not indebted. Everybody else is.
No, true. I mean, all I'm saying is that going by the current numbers, I think so. Looks like that if you want to create an additional space, it will have to be through taxation. I mean, because
but taxation is long-term.
If I may jump in here, these discussions about the deficit and all is extreme guesswork, right? Even when we talked the most about deficit in the early 90s, everybody claimed that China had very low deficit, right, compared to India. But China was using its banks with huge NPAs.
Right.
Now, if you bring that into the budget, they had much higher deficit than India had.
That's true.
So I don't think in this discussion we really know what's going on. I fully agree with the analysis he made in the sense that if we look at the world cannot revive us. The world economy is such that we cannot be revived by looking outside. We are a huge economy. We have a lot of young people entering. We are a consumption-driven economy, have been since 91, right? So why can't we cash in on that? There's a lot of infrastructure to be built, right? A lot of things to be done. And therefore, I fully agree that the fiscal stimulus is necessary now. Let's not worry about the deficit so much.
Well, I think that's the thinking even in the advanced countries. I mean, the prescription in US also is that you have to...
Yeah, but we shouldn't be following them. We should follow us.
But I think physical discipline is also necessary.
But I think we ourselves have put in FRBM in place. I mean, so unless you relax...
Nobody is saying that give up. We are ourselves architects of the FRBM Acts. All these legislations, today the central government and all the 29 state governments have subjected themselves to the fiscal discipline.
Right.
And nobody is saying that we have not gained out of it. All that we are saying is that you need a cyclically adjusted version of fiscal discipline.
I completely
You can't be rigid.
Plus, we should not mix up objectives with constraints. Yeah. Fiscal deficit is a constraint. It's not an objective that we must meet it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you want to push your growth to 8%, I think you will require fiscal stimulus, I agree. Otherwise, you'll have to live with a lower growth rate.
So can we go to the second last portion of the discussion, which is what I had said at the beginning, that, I mean, if each of the panelists could say that ideally what should the finance minister do in the current budget? and not realistically. And we are talking about, like, you said that, that fiscal stimulus.
I think in a way he spelled out what ideal.
Yeah,
And
so
I
ideally you said that your ideal
and
would be,
Subhashish agreed with
would
him
be a
saying
strong
that
fiscal stimulus. What would
Well, let me say, ideally, I mean, we've been talking about the economy, we've been talking about the change, scope of the budget. What we haven't talked about is, of course, the timing of the budget. And this is an issue which is going to come up because it's 4 days before elections in a number of states kick in. And so it's a budget which, whatever it contains, is going into with in a political atmosphere which is not the best atmosphere for a budget. Okay, a lot of people would have been saying
Charged up politically.
that, postpone the budget. We have also, I think, all agreed that we really don't know much about the economy to do a reasonable budget. So it is that the government is short on information regarding the future. It's on a rather politically weak position as far as the budget is concerned about being accused of, playing to the elections. And what Mr. Srivastava said, which is very important, and I agree entirely with, which is that in this situation that we are in, I do not see any reasonable way out into a higher trajectory of growth. Or in fact, I would say the trajectory at the moment is down. To actually try and push it up, there is no reasonable way of doing it without actually changing the FRBM. There is a committee which will give, and hopefully it will actually suggest things much on the lines of what Mr. Srivastava said. But if that committee's thing is going to come in, it's not going to come in between now and 31st of this month.
So I just wanted to put in one question.
So basically, I will give you a very short answer. I think if the finance minister basically says that these are the problems we are facing in the economy, much like what we've said, with his own spin, and says that, look here, whatever we need to do, we have to have a government-led recovery of this. On the other hand, much of this depends upon all the parties agreeing. And we are going to get, a recommendation from the FRBM committee. So I have a voter account, and in order to pass things like GST and others, you will need the other parties to come on board. So actually basically postpone the flashy part of the budget, except an intent on larger government expenditure, to after the 18th of March or whatever it is, when all the political tamasha is over and you can get back to the the serious business of actually making a budget and taking into account both better information and a political climate more suitable to a budget which will work.
Yeah, so one question that I had in this, which is a subset of this question only, and which is of course linked to demonetization, that at least in the initial month of demonetization, there was an expectation that the government would either via additional taxes or through the currency which never came back to the government, would get a financial leeway, a one-time financial leeway to do some additional spending on a host of stuff. Is that expectation now more or less over or no? Or is it that?
No, see, some of these are already there.
One last question after that.
Yeah.
No, let's put it this way. See, even a voter account can have whatever the Prime Minister said in his speech on the 1st of January. Yeah. All of them can be there. Yeah. The Jan Dhan, not the Jan Dhan, what is this? The Kalyan.
Pradhan Mantri.
That is in place. So anything which comes into that course can be spent. So those sorts of things can obviously continue. You don't need a new budget to do that. Those are already in place.
I think we say because in 5 states election is going on, so don't put your budget. I think this is not the way to run this country. We must have a disciplined financial year. When we preponed the budget, it was an intention when we take a certain decision, because this budget is for 125 crore people, not for, and the state election and the central budgets are two different things. The question is, in which fair, transparent and decisive manner central government will take
But
decision.
that's not the question.
I'm replying on the.
The question really was that what should the finance minister ideally do?
Definitely, after demonetization, our economy, we want the concept of governance, and the people expect more tax reform, the people expect more social inclusion, the people expect more investment in infrastructure, the people expect more job growth and more growth for the rural sector. And in the last budget, if you've seen, I think that in the consistency and continuity of the steps taken by the government last 2 years, I think it will be reflect more people-friendly budget that we hope.
Lokesh, what are your expectations?
I think if I was supposed to give just one recommendation, he should get passed, which is going to lay down a framework for economy regaining the strength back. I think it would be consensus on GST. Because if a consensus on GST is achieved, I have no doubt in my mind that you're really looking at entering a phase of different kind of tax compliance altogether. And in a way, if you're saying that your income disclosure scheme coupled with PMGKY is going to add more taxpayers, that coupled with GST is going to give to the government a fairly sustainable set of taxpayer base. To some extent, I also agree that we don't need to be prisoners of FRBM. If a flexibility in the FRBM targets is going to lead to a situation where the economy can go back to its original growth plan, I think it would be worth the gamble. But having said that, kindly bear in mind today that the level of mistrust between the states and the government, let's take for instance the compensation formula. What is compensation formula at the end of the day? The states are saying, please make good my loss or give me the necessary fiscal leeway to tamper with my FRBM targets. Because the entire debate on compensation, loss for GST is that. So I think once you get past the GST, you possibly will be able to build that de minimis level of trust with the state government, and in a way simultaneously, kind of formalize the fiscal room, additional fiscal room that's available to the states. I think if one can do that.
So I would say, I agree that consumption needs to be given a push, but there are ways of doing it. One way which has been tested is that you can create infrastructure and yet give a boost to consumption is build the roads. We've seen it in Vajpayee's time also. So that momentum should be further increased. And the second thing is through the tax reforms. In the sense we've done demonetization. We're also getting more taxpayers into the net. Now simplify the tax system so that you can reap the benefits of it. So I think that's where, and even if you look at direct taxes, inflation has been going up every year and the slabs don't hold. The value of, in real terms of the slab is much lower now. So you need to increase the nominal value of the slab to
everything, even the exceptions like medical insurance premium and all that, right. That's been set 20 years ago or something. So
that will give a boost to consumption demand, and I think together, if with a simpler and fairer tax system and more people into the net, I think your buoyancy will only increase. We've already seen it when we reduced direct tax rates. Direct tax collections actually increased. They did not fall as a percentage of GDP. So
I think I liked what Avijit said, right? But what strategy will be worked out, I don't know. But I think that there are a few things he has to do whenever he presents the budget, I think, to increase the trust in the demonetization and all of that. One is that he had made a commitment that he's going to reduce the corporate tax and get rid of exemptions. Unfortunately, in the last budget, he announced many more exemptions. So he has to correct that. This is already 2 years down the road. right? So I think that should be done. The other thing, since you did jog my memory of what I said, right, though I don't think it is within the finance ministry's turf to do that, but since the budget has become a policy statement and doesn't really depend only or is not restricted to finance only, so I wish to see, right, this is as an economist, we always predict what we want rather than what will happen. So I wish to see, since demonetization was a bold decision, right? The government wants to take bold decisions. If it does, then it should, get rid of this small versus large. Startups, yes, the support to startups is necessary given the, name and shame that you are talking about. We are also embarrassed of failing, right? And hence we don't take risk. So therefore the support to startups is a good one. But this distinction between small and large is the start of the corruption. The moment you put in thresholds, and unfortunately the government keeps putting in thresholds, every policy that it does, no change from the UPA, every policy that is there, it comes with a threshold. Right? And the moment you put in a threshold, after demonetization and digitization, you're just giving more opportunities for corruption. Right? So I sincerely hope that given the path that they have promised to follow, that they really follow it. Get rid of exemptions, reduce the corporate tax, and get rid of these thresholds.
No, actually, can I just add? See, there are thresholds and thresholds. The real problem with thresholds in this context is that at some point you put a huge marginal taxation rate to just cross the threshold. And the real solution to that is reduce the marginal rate at that point to whatever is the marginal rate at that point. So basically you say that you are not going to pay tax.
May I stop you right there? You were talking about strategy, I am talking about strategy. Don't push for a lower marginal rate. Push for linearity, no change.
No.
Maybe, then you will get a lower marginal rate.
I'm not reducing the marginal rate.
The strategy is get rid of it.
But I'm saying
fight for getting rid of it.
No, you give an exemption on tax up to a certain amount to everybody. After that, you kick in with whatever tax rate you have.
Precisely. If it is for everybody the same, I will not call it a threshold. But we have for you this, for that person that entity something else.
You simply say that up to 50 lakhs. A turnover, there is nothing.
There's a disconnect between both of you. Since he worked in North
Hey,
Block,
we are
I
economists
know
after all.
exactly what he means by saying exemptions. What he means by saying exemption is exemptions that you give to businesses.
I'm also saying that.
Yeah, I thought you were referring to individuals.
No, I'm talking about businesses. Okay. I'm talking about businesses that you get into the tax system.
Correct.
Only above a certain turnover or a certain employment.
Sure. In fact, the entire genesis of debate on GST started when you were there in North Block by saying that GST probably is an answer to do away with exemptions and one rate or two rates.
But it is amazing how
But
many exemptions there are and how many rates there are.
We have 7 rates and we still have exemptions.
I'm telling you, that's why strategy is very important in India. Yeah. You can never try for the ideal thing because that will never happen.
Okay, now
but you should try for it because then something good will happen.
Now that we have gone past the ideal, what are the realistic things that what does he actually is likely, given the political backdrop, given the fact that he might have limited headway in terms of the tax that he has in his hands and the money that he can spend. What is he likely to do?
No, the big question.
Will he actually touch taxes at all? What are the expectations? Or will it just be more spends on social sector?
See, look here, what he has to do,
yeah,
if this is taken to be the final budget,
yeah,
there is nothing more to come, then one of the things he has to do is to show some sympathy for people who have suffered.
Suffered in the demonetization.
So the people who have had to go back from Delhi, the poor. So there has to be something slightly more perhaps than what the Prime Minister has already announced. Why slightly? I don't know. What they expect, because expectations run very high on the ground. The second thing is the middle class. The middle class is essentially watching for tax cuts, or at least exemption limits going up.
Every year we watch.
So these two are the demands coming from him, from the middle class and the class which matters more politically. But if he does that and he doesn't have an FRBN thing, he's got precious little to do for the investment side. And in which case, you have got precious little to show as a budget.
Well, I agree with this fact that the finance minister has to bring the mood of the nation a little more on the positive side. Nation is sulking and sullen, and therefore there has to be something that would set the mood of the people right. And this in budget making context generally results into numerous listing of concessions and subventions and so on. We got a sample from the speech of the Prime Minister of that. So I think one part of the budgetary exercise is going to be about additional concessions. In my view, that is the less important part. This is symbolic. This is going to be framed in a way in which not heavy magnitudes will not be involved, but the number of concessions could be quite large. But what is really going to affect the economy and what is really going to push the economy and therefore in the medium to long term put the mood of the nation actually right is what happens immediately after the budget. And by that I mean is that the case for bringing the budget forward, and there is only one reason for which it is being forwarded, and that is that the government would be able to spend almost immediately after March. And the complaint has been that if you have a budget which is actually passed in May or so, then you lose the monsoon months and you start your expenditure programs something in September. That is to say, capital expenditure programs, which is what happened last year and for all these successive years. So the case for bringing forward the budget is to actually, as soon as you have the approvals, you go and spend, and you gain additional 3 to 4 months of spending, and that expenditure has to be large. So I come back to the issue of how are you going to finance this, and I think that government would gain fiscal windfall out of demonetization, both because of extinguishment of money and because of additional tax revenue, one time IDS 2 in addition to IDS 1, and therefore let us say that would give the government a short term push of about 0.75 percentage point of GDP. And that must be immediately spent. Now if you track capital expenditure relative to GDP of the central and the state governments, the budgeted was 4.5, which is less than what should be ideal, but actual is not going to be more than 3%. So you are actually starting with a deficiency in capital spending. The whole point of achieving revenue account balance was that all that your borrowing is there must be spent on capital spending. But it's not happening. So that is what has got to happen. But this must also be counterbalanced by one major disadvantage to which Abhijit actually referred to earlier, which is that we are making budget almost blindfolded in terms of information availability. Now, if you look at the cyclicality of the way tax revenues are actually gathered, you would find that there is a seasonality, which is June, September, December and March. These are the peak months when revenues actually very sharply increase. And we are going to miss the December and March peak because we are going to really look at what is the data available for 2 peaks. The June peak is a very mild one. September is a more meaningful peak, and that's all that we are going to get. But on the December peak, a good amount of data that is presently showing in terms of tax revenue is actually advance payment in November itself. And that's why there is a little bit, but if you talk to state governments, there is a good reduction in motor vehicle tax and stamp duty and registration fees. Significant reduction. That's why states are asking for this additional room for borrowing. So I think that the advantage of advancing expenditure can be really realized only when you spend. But if you get the budget approvals and don't spend, then of course that advantage would be lost. But at the same time, the quality of budget making, I think, is going to suffer unless we change the ways in which the revenues are collected and so on.
Mr. Yadav, what do you think will be the, how realistically, how will it differ from What are the constraints the finance minister will be working under?
And what will be the budget?
I mean, you said that there should be major tax reforms, but will there be? Because there seems to be some buzz that the tax reforms might actually not happen this year.
Being a functioning of my government and the ideology of my party.
Okay, we'll then. No, then why don't we First, why don't we start with you? Yeah. What do you expect the realistic budget to be?
I told you I don't predict. I'm not a good economist, so I don't predict. Only good economists predict.
What do you expect?
I really, as I said, I expect him to commit to do what he had committed to, since it's the second opportunity he will have. Last time he ducked, but this time he should be
third opportunity.
Yeah. So, but he had the opportunity to do something last year, which he did not. He ducked. This year he should move towards what he had committed to, and I do hope that he gets rid of the exemptions. That's all.
We will come. Okay. Thanks so much for coming.
I conclude only this.
Yeah.
That as far the functioning of our government is concerned, definitely our Prime Minister very hardly working for the elimination of poverty for our country. So I hope that it will be for the economic inclusion of all poor section. It will provide an opportunity to the aspirational Bharat. It will be given a transparent system to all persons, those who are dealing with the tax and all system, and it will be give justice to all section of society.
Mukesh, what do you expect realistically?
I think he will take a bold step in terms of rejigging the tax rates.
He will.
Because I think he recognizes that lower tax rates have a spillover impact, because there is only so much that the government can do by increasing the spend on infrastructure. So I think whereas the common man's objective will be in his mind, from a political standpoint, but I don't think he's going to ignore business. I also anticipate that there will be some bold tax and regulatory reforms on political parties. I think the Prime Minister indicated that in his speech. I think they will do something about it. And a simple example, if trusts are taxed on unanimous donations, why shouldn't political parties be? I know it's a controversial question before him, but I think the Prime Minister seems to be committed to at least cleansing what goes on as a host of activities which people and economists also don't debate about. We keep on talking about the parallel economy, but we don't talk about the parallel economy that gets generated because of our political systems. So I would expect reforms. Maybe there is something on the land side, land reform side as well. I don't know whether the current Benami Act is good enough for him to address the menace of parallel economy that enters the real estate sector. In the past, along with the Benami law, specifically with respect to land laws, they've been talking about national registry. Some of those bold reforms, of course, the implementation task will lie at the state level. But I think somewhere in his mind,
in fact, the
Prime Minister's mind,
state problem.
Entirely it is
entirely a state.
He knows that these two sectors have to be dealt with if his larger agenda of curbing the black economy is not fulfilled. Because now, if you look at the impact of demonetization, I think he recognizes that a substantial part of the parallel economy is hidden on those two sectors. So how do you really deal with those sectors? I don't think that you can leave the larger economic objective of parallel economy where it is. Demonetization probably would be one of the first steps, and I think we should expect more.
Mr. Joshi.
Yeah, on the direct tax front, I would expect changes in slabs, etc., and some rationalization as far as corporate taxes are concerned. So I think that is one expectation. I think that that I have. And second, I think is we've not talked about employment generation. I think you look at the sectors. construction is the most labor intensive sector and it's slowed down. So I think there has to be a boost to that sector, whether it is through real estate or whatever, and real estate is down. So I think some measures to boost the construction activity, whether it is roads, whether it is houses, I think which generate employment, because employment has been a casualty in the last few years.
So that is what I could understand is that net, I mean, what is the expectation is that the additional government spending on roads and ports and all will to a certain extent provide the kind of labor demand which is being lost because of, let us say, private real estate construction slowing down.
But the problem with private real estate at the moment is that there is so much excess capacity again that even if you actually give interest rate cuts, people start buying, it's not necessarily going to revive construction in residential flats that quickly.
Particularly in the low end.
Low end में हो सकता है. Low end में हो सकता है.
Because inventory is high in the
middle and upper.
Middle and upper.